the venomous one. In case
yes.
you're wondering,
This one, my
it's
friend,
in the
will be
bag. Vile advance. Ooh, It's in the bag!
This
Quick
is
as
complete
venom.
and utter bullshit. This is complete and utter bullshit.
30 seconds to battle.
Yes. Going. Agitation.
This is the very definition of first blood.
First blood. I thought I saw that in the forecast.
Impaled. Yes. A touch of venom. Yes. My venom flows. As you say. Nothing for your troubles. With Vim and Venom. Impaled. A touch of venom. Quick as venom. With Vim and Venom. Ooh, ah. Going. I'm under attack. Caustic blow. Turn. Yes. My venom flows. As you say. Ah. Yes. Vile advance. Yes. Agitation. Go for me. with vim and venom.
Killing spree! Double kill!
Going. Agitation. Quick as venom. A touch of venom. My venom flows. As you say. Yes. Yes.
Middle tower is under attack.
Toxic attack. Vile. Cursed antidote.
Drop small. I'll do the same for you.
Regurgitated into the world. With vim and venom. I deserve this. Ruination. Venom pays. Sweet toxin. Attack! As you say.
Bottom tower is under attack. Radiant have fortified
Quick as
their
venom.
structures against attack.
A touch. I'm under attack.
Mega kill!
Agitation. Vile advance. Ever more venomous. Ah, sweet toxicity.
Unstoppable! The enemy attacks your middle tower.
Impaled. Going.
Killing spree!
With watch this spot. Taste my venom.
Meshmate!
Impaled. Coin for my efforts. Agitation. A plague on our foes. Quick as venom. It's in my nature.
Look to your top tower.
As you say.
Your top tower is under attack. This is the real deal.
Vile advance.
Look to your top tower.
A touch of
Tower is
venom.
fallen. May it be the last.
Yes. My venom flows. Payment due. Quick as venom.
Your bottom tower.
Yes. Yes. Move them off. Attack.
Radiant structures are fortified. Your middle tower faces a terrible test. The enemy attacks your middle tower.
A spare rib! Go free.
Like a blight, I return. As you say. With vim and venom. A touch of venom. Vile advance.
You must have died of fright.
My venom flows again. In venom. Coin for my efforts. Well warded. Quick as venom. Well warded. As you say.
His top tower has fallen.
Sweet toxicity.
Tower faces a terrible test. Which protects also requires protection. Killing spree!
It's in my nature. With vim and venom. Warded off. Sweet toxin. Watch this spot. Caustic blow. Vile advance. Quick as venom. Agitation. Yes. Impaled. A touch of venom, a plague on our foes. Yes. Yes. Impaled. My loyal ward. My venom flows. As you say. Enemy I grapple with.
Double kill!
The plague on our foes. With vim and venom. I'm not ready. Plague our enemies. Yes. Venom's vengeance. Quick as venom. Taste my venom. My venom glands in go. Agitation. Well warded. Vile advance. Ooh, ah. venom. A touch of venom. Yes. Ruination. As you say.
Regeneration.
Taste my venom. Impaled. Agitation. Ward them off. With vim and venom. Yes. Sweet toxin. Watch this spot. Going. Yes. Quick as venom. A touch of venom. Yes.
Radiant structures are fortified.
With vim and venom.
Bottom tower is under attack.
Boy, flashlight.
Now you must decide what comes next. Double kill!
Fast. Spirit breaker.
Your bottom tower is under attack. Your bottom tower is under attack. Your bottom tower has fallen. An equal bounty must be claimed. Bottom tower is under attack.
Back from death's door. Quick as venom. Incoming.
Your middle tower is under attack.
Going. My loyal ward. As you say, ward them off. And it's off. quick as venom. Well rewarded.
Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and what we're doing. The first variable we want to think about in terms of workspace optimization is vision and light. Now, in a previous episode of the Huberman Lab podcast devoted all to habits, I talked about the importance of dividing your 24-hour day into 3 different phases. And for those of you that haven't heard that episode, I'm just going to briefly summarize what I described. From the time you wake up in the morning until about 6 or 7 or 8, sometimes 9 hours later, your brain is in a unique state. It is in a state of high levels of dopamine, a neuromodulator, and high levels of epinephrine, as well as hormones like cortisol and so forth. Without going into the biology of those things, they set your brain into a state of high alertness. And this is true whether or not you indulge in caffeine or not. I know some of you say, oh, I really don't wake up until the afternoon. I'm much more alert and focused in the afternoon. We will talk about that phase of the 24-hour day in a moment. But that early part of the day is a time of day in which, for sake of workspace optimization, being in a brightly lit environment can lend itself to optimal work throughout the day, not just during that early phase. And so, while on many episodes of this podcast, I've also emphasized the importance of getting morning sunlight in your eyes within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. Not as often, but now and again, I will also mention that it's important to light your daytime environment as brightly as you safely can. So if you are going to be doing work in this early, what I call phase 1 portion of your day, you want to have as much light and indeed as much overhead light shining on you as safely possible. Now, of course, you don't want it so bright that it's glaring and you have to squint, etc. But you want as much light as is safely possible. And you can do that a couple of simple ways. One is if you do own or you're in an environment where you have overhead lights, turn on those overhead lights. What's special about overhead lights for setting alertness is that the neurons in our eyes, which are called melanopsin ganglion cells, that's the fancy name, melanopsin ganglion cells are mainly enriched in the lower half of our retinas, in our eyes, and view the upper visual field. Those neurons send little wires to an area of our hypothalamus right above the roof of our mouth that creates a state of alertness. Now, early in the day, we want to be as alert as possible, and this phase 1 of our circadian cycle is when we are best at doing analytic, detail-type work. So we're going to go into other aspects of workspace optimization that are important for phase 1, but during phase 1, again, within 0 to about 8 or 9 hours after waking, bright lights in your environment, in particular overhead lights, are going to facilitate focus. They're going to facilitate further release of things like dopamine and norepinephrine and healthy amounts of cortisol. And we want that to happen early in the day for a variety of reasons. For instance, we don't want that cortisol peak to happen too late in the day. That's actually associated with depression and insomnia and a number of things that we just don't want. So one of the things that I've done for my workspace is to make sure that when I wake up in the morning, I do go get my sunlight. If the sun isn't out, I turn on as many bright artificial lights as I can manage or tolerate, and then I go get my sunlight exposure. But once I set out to do some work, that all the overhead lights in that room are on, as well as lights in front of me. And that's, again, to stimulate heightened levels of focus and further release of these neuromodulators that I mentioned before, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Now, the way that one could do that could be a very low-cost way of having, for instance, a desk lamp and those overhead lights. If you're somebody that wants to take this to the next level, you can purchase a ring light, which is, I think those are mainly made for people doing selfie-type videos, for Instagram posts and things of that sort. Ring lights can be pretty cost-effective, and yet they're very bright, and they have the sort of bright blue light that is going to optimally stimulate those melanopsin ganglion cells. So some people I know will have a blue light or a bright LED on their desk in front of them. And indeed, I have one of these. I don't use a ring light. I use a light pad. The particular light pad I bought on Amazon. I can mention the brand, but again, I have no financial affiliation to them. This is the Artograph light pad. It's designed for drawing. And it says on it 930 lux. Lux is just a measure of brightness. So I place that on the desk in front of me, and I turn it on essentially throughout this phase 1 of the day. Even if I walk away from the desk, I tend to keep it on. It doesn't consume that much energy. And in that way, I'm constantly being bombarded with photons that keep my levels of alertness up, because the early part of the day is when I do the majority of that focused work. Again, you don't need the light pad. You can use a ring light, or you can simply use any kind of other lights that you might happen to have, artificial lights. For those of you that can place your desk near a window, and even better to open the window, that would be really fantastic. I don't have access to that. Why would I say open the window? Well, it turns out that sunlight is going to be the best stimulus for waking up your brain and body through this melanopsin to hypothalamus system. And by looking at sunlight through a window, it's 50 times less effective than if that window were to be open, mostly because those windows filter out a lot of the wavelengths of blue light that are essential for stimulating the eyes and this wake-up signal. So all of this rests on the premise that we need to be alert in order to do our work, in particular focused work. And I've talked about before in the habits episode, and I'm saying again now, that first phase of the day, that first 7 or 8 or 9 hours of the day is really the time in which our neurochemistry is primed for getting the most amount of focused, kind of challenging work done where a lot of precision and detail is required. So you want to brightly light your work environment during that first phase. Again, from the time you wake up, try and get sunlight, but then even if you're going to get exercise or do other things, you want to get as much bright light in your eyes as you safely can, and then you want to light your work environment. Now, in the afternoon, starting at about 9 and continuing until about 16 hours after waking, you want to start dimming the lights in that environment. Now, you don't want to make it dark because you don't want to get sleepy at 2 o'clock in the afternoon unless you're going to take a brief nap, which I do and is perfectly fine as long as it doesn't interfere with your nighttime sleep. But the idea is that in this so-called phase 2 of the 24-hour cycle, from about 9 to 16 hours after waking, you want to bring the level of lights down a bit. And when I say down, I literally mean down. Having lights that are in front of you is fine, but overhead lights at that time are not going to be optimal for the sorts of neurochemical states that your brain wants to be in. The states that I'm referring to are a shift from the dopamine and norepinephrine that's highest early in the day to increases in things like serotonin and other neuromodulators that put your brain into a state that's better for creative endeavors or for more abstract thinking. Now, as we'll soon see, there are other things you can do to improve creative thinking and abstract thinking. And in fact, there are things you can do to improve analytic thinking. We will talk about those, things that are distinct from light. But right now, we're just focusing on light. So what I recommend doing and what I personally do is I will turn off overhead lights in the afternoon. It's not completely dim. It's not completely dark. But I will start to reduce the amount of overhead light and just simply keep the light pad on and whatever other lamps I have.
So dudes, welcome.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking? This ought to be interesting. My sense
happen to be using. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is screen brightness. This is highly individual. People have different retinal sensitivities. What I mean by that is everybody differs in terms of how bright they can tolerate their visual environment and their screen. And whether or not you are sensitive to light or not will depend on a lot of factors. Some of it is eye color. Indeed, people with darker color eyes generally can tolerate more bright light than others. I have green eyes. I am very, very sensitive to light. If I'm outdoors at a cafe or something and the table has any kind of reflective properties and it's a sunny day, I can barely see the person across the table from me unless I'm wearing sunglasses. Some people, other members of my family, for instance, have dark brown eyes and can just sit there and have a conversation without the need for sunglasses at all. So there's tremendous variation there. One or the other isn't healthy or advantageous necessarily. Just understand that you never want to be in an environment where it's painful to maintain looking at whatever it is that you're looking at. If something's painful to look at, it could be damaging to your eyes, so you do want to protect your eyes. Now, in this second phase of the day, since most of us are working indoors, but even if you're working outdoors, you want to try and get the amount of light reduced overall, but in particular that overhead light. And you also want to start reducing the amount of blue light that you're being exposed to. So somewhere around 4 or 5 p.m., which for me is, about 12 hours after I've been awake or 14 hours after I've been awake, I will turn off that light pad and start to transition the lights in my environment to more yellows and reds. Now, I can't always do this. I have friends that actually have converted their entire homes from blue light early in the day to red light late in the day. That's really cool and fantastic. I haven't done that. There's a cost to doing that, and it is optimal in terms of optimizing productivity and sleep and so forth, but it's not feasible for a lot of people. But what I do is I simply switch to using yellow lamps. I will turn off that LED in the later afternoon, again around 4 or 5 p.m., and I tend to wake up around 6 a.m. or so. I'll turn those off, and what I'll try and do also is I'll try and dim the screen that I'm working on so that I can still manage to see everything that I need to see, but it's quite a bit dimmer than it was early in the day. So that's phase 2 of the day, and that's how we want to think about light. And then I'll just mention, because I know there are people who are working in the middle of the night, there's phase 3, which is about 17 to 24 hours after waking. And I realize that for shift workers or for people that are pulling all-nighters or for students, oftentimes you need to be awake and studying in the middle of the night. I myself am somebody who for years would pull anywhere from 5 to 10 all-nighters per year. I still pull an all-nighter now and again because of deadlines and so forth. I don't recommend it. If you can avoid it, great. But many people just simply have to do this for sake of shift work or because of impending deadlines or procrastination or all of the above. If you're going to be doing work in that third phase of your circadian cycle, you really want to limit the amount of bright light that you're getting in your eyes to just the amount that allows you to do the work that you're doing. Because if you get light in your eyes that's any brighter than that, you're going to severely deplete your melatonin levels. You're going to severely shift your circadian clock, and it's effectively like traveling to another time zone. So if you stay up from 3 a.m. until 6 a.m. or 2 a.m. until 4 a.m. working on a term paper or something of that sort, and you're getting bright light in your eyes, you are effectively flying 6 hours to a different time zone, or at least that's what your body registers it as. And it can really throw your sleep and your metabolism and a number of other things out of whack. Now, there's an exception to this, which is if you really want to be awake, it can often be beneficial to flipping on all the lights in the room and keeping them really bright. One of the hardest things to do is to stay up all night studying when you're in a dim environment. So you have to determine the trade-off between whether or not you want to shift your clock or whether or not you want to get the work done. And I would say the ideal situation is to sleep at night and to do your work during the day and in the afternoon. But if you do have to be awake in the middle of the night, do understand that you want to dim those lights overall. You would not want to use that LED. You would not want to have overhead lights on unless you're really struggling to stay awake, in which case you want to get as many bright lights on as possible. So there are a couple tricks to all-nighters. I don't really want people pulling all-nighters unless they have to, but there are a few things that you can do without taking stimulants in order to stay up all night that can be beneficial, that maximize on your biology. One of them that's a little less commonly known is you can drink 32 ounces of water and commit to not going to the bathroom for 90 minutes at least. Turns out that there's a circuit that goes from your bladder, literally neurons that go from your bladder to your brainstem. And when you have to urinate, it makes you very alert, as many of you have probably experienced. This is actually what wakes us up in the middle of the night when we have to use the bathroom, is this circuit for alertness that goes from full bladder. It's signaled by the bladder being full to the brainstem. And this is the circuit that is disrupted in kids that have bedwetting issues And there are a number of cognitive behavioral approaches to that. Sometimes bedwetting in very young kids is because the circuit hasn't developed yet. Most adults, fortunately, are not bedwetting, but you can increase the amount of alertness in your system and remain awake in the middle of the night by drinking a little bit more water than you normally would, and then refraining from going to the restroom. That certainly will lend itself to alertness. You know how difficult it is to fall asleep when you have to use the restroom, for instance. So that's one tool. The other thing is, again, to flip on as many bright lights in the environment as possible. And then, of course, people will rely on stimulants like caffeine or even more aggressive stimulants. That's not something I necessarily recommend. You'll each have to determine that for you. But if you do, in fact, have to use all-nighters for any reason, you can maximize this bladder-to-brain approach and the bright light approach. Okay, so that more or less covers how bright to keep your overall environment and how bright to keep your screen. If you really want to get nerdy about this, there is a free app called Light Meter where you can start measuring how many lux, how many photons are in a given environment. It's actually measuring reflectance of photons and so on. If you can look up what a lux meter does, if you like. I don't necessarily recommend doing that. I don't want to set a critical threshold by which, for instance, we say once your environment is more than 1500 lux, then it's too bright or not bright enough, etc. Everyone has different retinal sensitivities. Everyone will find that different levels of brightness will cause them to be alert. Different levels of dimness, if you will, in the room will cause them to feel sleepy. You really want to just modulate across the 24-hour cycle where it's very bright as it safely can be early in the day so that you are alert. You can do your focused, detailed work in that first phase. And then in the afternoon, as you move into more creative type works or abstract thinking or working with other people in kind of a brainstorming mode, that you would shift to dimmer lights, yellow lights, eliminate the blue lights as much as possible. Now that's light, but there's another aspect of vision that has been shown to be critically important for how alert we are going to be and how well we can maintain that alertness. And that has to do with where our visual focus is in a given environment. So I'm not talking about overall brightness. What I'm referring to now is simply where you place your phone or your tablet or computer screen or book, whatever it is that you happen to be looking at. There's a very underappreciated and yet incredible aspect of our neurology that has to do with the relationship between where we look and our level of alertness. And it works in a very logical way. We have clusters of neurons in our brainstem, and those clusters of neurons control our eyelid muscles and they control our eye movements up and down and to the sides. And indeed, if you were to look at an eyeball, I've looked at a lot of eyeballs in my lab, and I teach neuroanatomy, so we do this from time to time, we would see that there are 6 muscles attached to your eyeball. Now, 4 of them are located at the top, the bottom, and the 2 sides of your eyeball, sort of at the 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock of your eyeball. And those muscles can move your eye in the socket from side to side and up and down. And then we also have some muscles that can actually pull the eyeballs at angles, okay? So we have different muscles that can move the eyes at different angles as well. And that's why we can look up into the side or down into the side, not just from side to side or up or down. Now, the neurons that control those muscles have a very interesting feature, which is that when we are looking down toward the ground or anywhere below basically the central region of our face, the neurons that control that eye movement are intimately related to areas of the brainstem that release certain types of neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. And they activate areas of the brain that are associated with calm and indeed even with sleepiness. And there's an active inhibition or prevention of neurons that increase alertness. Now, the opposite is also true. We have neurons that place our eyes into an upward gaze above the sort of level of our nose and up above our forehead, literally looking up while keeping the head stationary. Or if you tilt your head back and you look up, these neurons are still active. Those neurons don't just control the position of the eyes and cause them to move up. They also trigger the activation of brain circuits that are associated with alertness. Now, this is a fundamental feature of the way that our eyes and brain are wired together and how they relate to what we call autonomic arousal. And there are a bunch of details there. We will actually have a guest in a few weeks who has learned to exploit these neurons and the fact that they control these different states of calm or alertness in order to generate hypnotic states, to place people into very atypical states in which they are both very alert and very calm. We'll save that for a future episode. But the important thing to understand is when you are looking down below the level of your nose, you are essentially decelerating your alertness. You're reducing your amount of alertness. It might be subtle, but it's happening. Whereas when you look straight ahead, or in particular when you look up, you're increasing your level of alertness. Now, this has some obvious implications. When we get sleepy, our eyelids tend to close and we tend to nod down. When we're wide awake, we tend to be wide-eyed. We don't tend to blink as often. And we tend to be chin up and kind of on vigilance and alertness. So this has a evolutionary or at least an adaptive component to it. This can be exploited, and indeed it's been researched in terms of how it can be used to optimize work environments. Contrary to what most people do, which is to look down at their laptop, tablet, or phone, if you want to be alert and you want to maintain the maximum amount of focus for whatever it is that you're reading or doing, you want that screen or whatever it is that you're looking at to at least be at eye level and ideally slightly above it. Now, I haven't seen many workspaces that take advantage of this very hardwired neurobiological fact. So what should you do with this information? Well, if you're somebody who sits down to do work and starts to feel sleepy or simply unfocused, unable to attend to whatever it is that you're doing, I highly recommend that you take your laptop or tablet. I do hope that most people aren't doing serious work on their phones because it's such a small visual window, and we can talk about why that's an issue later. And the idea would be to place that screen of your tablet or your laptop or other computer and try and get it elevated at least to nose level, your nose level, or even higher. Now, I realize that can be complicated to do. I've long just used a stack of books, or I'll sometimes take a box and turn it upside down and set it there. I do use a mixed standing seated desk. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. There are a number of different ways that you could do this. You could wall mount a monitor. I think many people are working with laptops. It's a little bit harder to do that with a laptop. Some people, though, will configure a second screen. You have to decide what's right for you and your budget. But again, in addition to having a brightly lit room to be able to focus and attend to whatever it is you're working on, you want to have that screen positioned high in your visual environment. Now, you wouldn't want it on the ceiling necessarily, although that would be pretty cool. But you do want it above you. Now, there are a couple solutions to this that don't involve a wall mount or stacking books or boxes. For instance, you could be one of those people that likes to lie in bed or on the sofa and get your screen up above you by putting pillows on your knees. I used to actually do a lot of my writing and work in the middle of the night. I don't do this anymore and I don't recommend it, but I used to do a lot of work from bed. Now I no longer bring electronics for work into the bedroom. I just really try and keep the bedroom for sleeping or whatever else. But in terms of lying down on the couch, it is somewhat easier to get that screen up above you. You can kind of slide underneath that screen and get typing. But there's a problem with that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. But it turns out that your posture, literally the position of your body relative to gravity, also has important implications for how alert you are. So ideally, you would be standing or seated. I would say the ideal would be standing. Second best would be seated. And your screen will be either directly in front of you or slightly above you. Or if you wanted to get really fancy, you could create a situation where it was above you and slightly tilted toward you so that you actually had to maintain a proper neck posture. This accomplishes a number of things. In addition to making you more alert, you also get away from the so-called text neck. You know, people are starting to look more like C's nowadays, the shape of the letter C, because we're constantly looking down. I do every once in a while see somebody who's texting in public with it at eye level. It always looks a little odd that they're doing that, but I always admire their posture at the same time, so we shouldn't give them a hard time. So this is another feature that you can arrange into your physical workspace. Again, whether or not you're seated or you're standing throughout the day, try and get that screen elevated. Now, with reference to posture, there are beautiful data illustrating that when we are standing up, those same neurons in our brainstem, locus ceruleus neurons, which release, I should mention, things like norepinephrine and epinephrine, those neurons become active when we are standing. They become even more active when we are ambulatory, when we are moving. And we will talk about treadmilling and cycling at your desk and so forth in a little bit. But when you sit, they become a little less active. And when you lie down, and indeed any time that you start to get your feet up above your waist or your head tilted back, those neurons fire less, and neurons in your brain that are involved in calming and indeed putting you to sleep start increasing their level of firing. It's a really beautiful system. So beautiful, in fact, that there are studies that show that as you adjust the angle of the body back, you actually get a sort of dose-dependent increase in sleepiness and calmness and a dose-dependent decrease in alertness. And so, as we were all told, to sit up straight, or even better, to stand up straight, and now I'm also telling you to get that visual thing that you're attending to, screen or otherwise, up in front of you or ideally above you, those things combine to generate maximum alertness. So you can think about how you might work this into various aspects of your homework environment or office work environment. But as I describe this, many of you are probably thinking what I'm thinking, which is, gosh, most of what we do is in complete opposite direction to all of this neurobiologically grounded advice. Most of us are looking down at our laptop while seated, or we are lying down, which is going to make us more sleepy, or we are positioning our computers in front of us, but we really aren't in an environment that's bright enough, and so on and so forth. So as you can tell, we're starting to layer in the various things that you can do. First, brightness in the room. Second, get that screen up, and try and put yourself into a posture for work that lends itself or promotes alertness, if indeed you want to be alert for that work. If your goal is to take a nap, get your feet elevated about 10 to 15 degrees above your head, maybe put a pillow underneath it, lie down and take a nap. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about workspace optimization. And I suppose you could also exploit that all-nighter trick that I talked about earlier. I actually did this when I was an undergraduate. I was a little bit masochistic in this way. I would drink coffee and water at fairly high volume. I wasn't, force drinking or anything like that. But I actually wouldn't allow myself to get up and use the bathroom except on a timer. So I think the longest I ever went was like 3.5 hours. It was kind of excruciating. I actually don't think that's necessarily a healthy advice. But again, you can use slight overconsumption of fluids in order to generate alertness. That was just me really trying to get as much work done as I could. I had a very, very demanding class schedule, and it was just the only way that I could get work done. If I was getting up every